Okay, here we are on our Westward lecture. We probably won't have time to go over it in class, and a lot of you said you had questions about populism, so I'm going to cover all of Westward, including populism, but we'll also do some discussion in class. This is chapter 26 of your textbook. Feel free to watch this if it helps. If you find them boring or unhelpful, please ignore them. A lot of you mentioned that you like to listen and take notes, so feel free to just put this on in the background and type notes as you listen. It's still me. Let's get started. So we've got to talk about the Native Americans. As always, we've been talking about them from pre-Columbian. They get a terrible deal. The Native Americans, basically, as they always have, are standing in the way of white settlers. At this point, they're out west. And so we have another theme of migration and conflict. And here we see not just fighting between Native Americans, but also the destroying of their culture. And we'll talk more about that with assimilation. We had this thing called the reservation system. Basically, we created reservations, which were essentially boundaries to push the Native Americans into, basically saying this is your land, this is the boundaries where you can live, and kind of containing them in one area. The promise was natives went to these reservations with the promise that the government would give them things they need, education, food, healthcare, etc. But they were often not given those things as well. So they were giving up their land and receiving almost nothing in exchange. Both sides, both the Native Americans and white settlers, are very violent. We see violence on both sides, and both sides kind of commit atrocities. One of the most famous is the Battle of Little Bighorn. Battle of Little Bighorn is really one of the more violent ones and an example of the conflict. It's also known as Custer's Last Stand for General Custer. There he is there. What a good-looking man. Natives essentially during this battle rebelled against the whites. Whites were moving into their reservation. So the tribe had already moved to a reservation, and now whites were moving in and taking it. So it was a rebellion, and it was an attack. The natives initially win. They kill almost everyone, including Custer. But eventually the government comes in and puts it down. So it's just a short-term victory. And most tribes eventually do succumb to the government. Even though we have these rebellions, the government and the white settlers win. Why does that happen? Let's talk about factors that lead to them kind of submitting to the government. Number one would be that the federal government was willing to back up land claims with military force. It wasn't they were just threatening it. It was that the government was perfectly fine sending out military forces to claim land and to move the natives. We saw that all the way back with Trail of Tears, and it has continued to this time. Number two, we have railroads. Railroads make it easy for settlers, for troops, for people to come out west quickly and in large numbers to put down the natives. We also still talking about disease. We talked about it way back at the beginning. Natives are still susceptible to white man's diseases, and we see a lot of them die from exposure to those. We have, your book talks about firewater. That's just really grain alcohol. A lot of natives were unfamiliar with alcohol, and you see a lot of addiction, a lot of dependency, and a lot of willing to trade or give up things in exchange for more alcohol. And then the last one is the extermination of the buffalo. Many tribes rely on all parts of the buffalo. We talked about that when we talked about the natives who rode horses and hunted buffalo, those tribes. And a lot of tribes do rely on the buffalo. And the buffalo starts to go practically extinct at this time period. Here's a cartoon. You can see the guys on the train shooting the buffalo. That was common. It was shooting them for sport, right? If you're on a train, hardly ever shooting them. Buffalo were also mowed down in the way, if they were in the way of the tracks. They were used to feed people who were working on railroads, and then a lot of times just for sport. So you see kind of the decimation of the buffalo population, which also in turn hurts the Native Americans who rely on the buffalo. There was the idea of assimilation, and assimilation means essentially in this case that Native Americans would join white culture. That's white in quotation marks, right? There are two sides in assimilation. One side thought assimilation would be a way to help them and a way to make them Americans and fit into society better. And then the other side thought it would be a way to contain them, to get rid of their savage ways. The Battle of Wounded Knee is a famous battle in the assimilation debate. It was the banning of the ghost dance, which was a traditional Native American dance. The natives did not like that, and so we lead to a bloody battle. We also have the Dawes Act comes out. The Dawes Act was part of the idea of assimilation because it was part of breaking down Native tribes. The act dissolved many tribes and broke up their reservations, so kind of spread them out, made it so that they weren't one united group. Land was given to Native households, and then the other land was sold by the government. So natives would get some land for their little house, and then the rest of the land would be sold by the government. The US government then in turn was supposed to use that money to civilize the natives, to set up schools to teach them the ways of whites, to give them an education. The Dawes Act is very devastating. One, because it forces assimilation, right? Giving up your culture and adopting another one. But two, it also hurts their native structure by dissolving the tribes and breaking them into small families. A lot of tribes were destroyed and hurt their native structure. How do you make money in the West? Everybody wants to go west, so let's talk about what they're doing out there. Big one would be mining, gold mining. Gold would be important. We talked about it with the California gold rush, the 49ers, and wait, there's a Colorado gold rush, the 59ers. The big idea about gold is that it helps the West grow because it attracts so many people. There's nothing people love more than the idea that they can just go out west and strike rich from gold. As we know from the California gold rush, that's often not the case. People aren't really making money. But some people are, and the gold in turn is going to finance part of the Civil War. But they're also going to start mining for other things out there. Particularly, they're going to find a lot of silver. And we'll talk more about silver when we get to populists, but you should know that they find large supplies of silver. Another way to make money was the cattle, the longhorn, this longhorn cattle. Business in Texas and the West was longhorn, selling the meat. It used to be hard to ship the meat, but what would help make it better? Obviously, railroads. We can put the cattle on the railroads and ship and move them easily. So basically, you'd have large herds be moved by cowboys, cattle ranchers, to these railroad stations. This system only works, right, if you have grass to feed the cattle. And we're going to see railroads take over that grass. The railroads bring out farmers who are going to farm that land. And with the loss of kind of free grass and places for the cattle to graze, you see the loss of that market. The big thing we've got, oh, there they are moving the cattle. Big thing we've got is farming. You have the Homestead Act in 1862, that's during the Civil War. It said settlers could acquire as much as 160 acres. All they had to do was live on the land for 5 years, improve it, and pay about $30. The government wanted to give up this land to fill up space. They had a ton of land. Why not have settlers out there? The Homestead Act seems like a good deal. Very rarely was it really helpful, although definitely a lot of people took advantage of it. There's a lot of drought, so not all the land is great for farming. The book talks about very specific regions, right, that were plentiful for farming. And you also see a lot of fraud with the Homestead Act. People, speculators, not just families going out and claiming land, speculators basically sending fake families out. And so that kind of hurts it. You have sodbusters come out. Those are people who are going to go kind of in the West in Kansas. The soil was thought to be not that fertile at first, and then you have the sodbusters come out, and they're going to dig up the land with the iron plow, leads to finding fertile land. And then in the very west, the land is not fertile until the government invests in irrigation. Irrigation is how we can move land from places with water to places without water. The government is going to fund huge irrigation projects in this time, and it really helps. It's another thing you can add to that list of how the government was involved in this time period. And so there we go about how they're making money. But they're going to face some problems. Oh, here's the Land Homestead Act. Okay, changes in the West. We have new states come out by 1890. This is what our states look like, right? Starting to look a lot like the United States today. And we consider this time period the end of the frontier. By 1890, which is what this map is showing, the census shows that there's no discernible frontier line. There's no particular region where there are just no people that needs to be conquered. We don't really have a frontier line, and so it's considered the closing of the frontier. Why is the frontier so important? You've read about it in this chapter, and you've read about it earlier, right? With migration, manifest destiny, all of that kind of things. One guy we can credit frontier legend to and the significance of the frontier is Frederick Jackson Turner. He writes an essay in which he kind of talks about the significance of the frontier, how helpful the frontier has been, and what point it plays in American history. The frontier is seen both as a state of mind, kind of that freedom moving west, and a symbol of opportunity, right? You can always move west and find a new way. The frontier is going to create some more economic problems, and we'll talk about that with the populace. With the loss of the frontier, though, we also lose that dream, the idea that you could always move west. We've been talking about that from the very beginning Americans got here, even when they were colonies, right? It was that pushing west, proclamation of 1763, right? Trying to stop them from moving west. But they've always had this dream that you could move west, you could find new opportunities. And now that we're losing the west, the frontier is kind of becoming connected to the country. You lose kind of that dream. Frontier, federal government, huge example of how the federal government played a role in this time period and how they helped settle the frontier. Couldn't have been done without the federal government. At this time, we also see changes in farming. We no longer see farming just for small families. We start to see focusing on a single cash crop, like wheat, like corn. So instead of supplying everything they would need, you start to see them basically farming one thing and then buying the other things they need. In order to do this, you need some pretty good managers, and unfortunately, farmers were not, right? A lot of them were family men, they'd grown up doing this, and so they're not really the best businessmen, and it causes a lot of problems. Oh my gosh, every time. This time I know how to pause. All right, that was a small break. That was my sister. Life lesson, love your siblings. They're built-in best friends and awesome. Back to farming. You start to see machines used as farming, which is great. And as we know, when we have machines, we can now produce goods, or in this case, food, faster and for lower prices, which is going to cause problems. So let's talk about problems. Number one would be low prices. Everything is great for farmers as long as prices are high, because they're making lots of money. But with lots of production, like we just talked about, and not just in the US, they had competition from international growers, prices drop. So farmers are making less money. Number two would be deflation. You start to see the dollar lose value. So not only are they making less money, but the dollars they're earning have less value. And that's because the lack of gold. We need gold to match the amount of dollars. If we have a lack of gold, we're going to see less currency in circulation. And you see that with President Cleveland. He's actually going to have to borrow money to borrow gold so he can put more money in circulation. You also have interest rates that farmers are dealing with. They have high interest rates. So farming is one of those things where you need a lot of money at the beginning of the season, right? To buy your seeds, to buy your machines. And then you don't make your money until the end of the season. So farmers had to borrow at the beginning of the season. And when there were high interest rates, it meant that they had to pay back a lot of money at the end of the season. If they're not making a ton of money, they have trouble paying back those debts. We also have Mother Nature causing problems. We've got grasshopper swarms, which is a little cartoon of that here. We've got cotton weevils, awesome word, and we've got drought. So not only are they subject to economic problems, but they can also be subject to nature, which, right, if any of these things happened, you would lose your crops or less crops. Farmers had to deal with a lot of fees as well. Railroads would charge them huge fees to transport their goods. Remember, railroads were like letting the government officials take the trains for free or send troops anywhere on discounted rates. And so they made the farmers pay a lot to get their crops to market. Farmers also had to deal with high taxes, and then they also had to deal with trusts, right? Trusts that controlled different parts of their industry. How's the farmer going to combat this? Who knows? Because the thing about farming is, are you near anyone? No. If you have to have hundreds of acres of land, it is hundreds of acres till your next neighbor. So it's hard for them to organize. They're used to being individual. Populace. So populism is just a movement for the common people. It's the voice of the common people. It's a very broad term. We're going to talk about it in context of this time period. Populist movement had a few early movements before we get to the actual populace. The first would be the Grange. The Grange was actually organized originally to kind of end isolation of the farmer that we talked about. Thought that with education and social events, the farmers could start to work together. Later, the Grange is going to adjust their goals and they're going to start to try and help the farmers overall, especially economically. The Grange actually tries to get a lot of people to make changes through politics, but the problem is those guys who go into politics for the Grange aren't great politicians. So you see a lot of bad laws. They're hurt by the court rulings. Remember the Wabash court case hurts them a lot. And although the Grange lives on, they lose a lot of power. The second group would be the Greenbacks Labor Party. They're still around. It was a combination of those Greenbackers who wanted that currency. We talked about them during the Civil War, and labor movement. So it's kind of this weird combination thinking about the workers. You start to see the Greenbacks Labor Party make some success. They elect actually 14 congressmen to power, but they can't really unite the farmers together, and not all farmers are on this movement. And the farmers need a group for themselves. And the last one we're going to talk about is the Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliance was founded in Texas, and it was supposed to break up the power of railroads and manufacturers, so to kind of take away the power by uniting the farmers together. The problem with the Farmers Alliance was they were pretty exclusive. They didn't want just anyone in their group. They ignored tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and blacks. That's really going to hurt their cause because it makes them, right, a smaller group with less support. Populist Party comes next, also known as the People's Party. So we often call them populists. Their official name was the People's Party. The populists, the best example of what the populists want is to look at the Omaha platform. That's their platform for the election of 1892. In Omaha, Nebraska, they come up with it. And here are the terms that they want from their platform. They want the popular election of senators. Senators were elected by state House of Representatives, or state Congress basically, and now they're calling for the common people, right? Makes sense, they're the People's Party, to vote for senators directly. In addition to that, they want the people to vote on referendums on issues. So instead of just Congress making all these laws, let the people vote on some laws, and that's done through referendums. They wanted to nationalize the railroads, the telephones, and the telegraph. Makes sense if they're getting kind of a bad deal from the railroads. It would make sense that then they want to try and stop the railroads' monopoly and the railroads overcharging them by having them controlled by the government. They call for a gradual income tax. They call for government to help them both with loans and with storing crops. There was a big call for storing their crops until prices rose, and so that the government should help them with that. They wanted the free and unlimited coinage of silver. The idea was, instead of just being dependent on gold and having all this deflation, we would have silver coins out in production too, which would mean more money and hopefully get rid of that deflation. They viewed deflation and not being able to pay back their debts as their biggest problem, and so they thought silver was the solution. They also wanted to limit the president to one term in a shorter work day, 8 hours, and that was kind of appealing more to the industrial side. So let's look at the elections. Election of 1892, you can see right here, this is where we get the Omaha platform, so the Populists are running as a third party. Did the Populists really have a chance? They didn't have a great chance. There were a lot of strikes during this time period, and the idea was strikers would join the populist cause, so it was kind of hopeful to them. The best example would be the Homestead strike, which was the strike of steelworkers, and so they thought the strikers might join their party. The good news is they did earn 22 electoral votes, which is pretty impressive for a third party, but as we know, that's really far from the majority. A lot of people say during this election that they lost because they didn't have the support from the South. You can see South, no support there. And from industrial workers. They didn't have support from industrial workers. So you can see they're green, by the way. That should have told you that. In the election of 1892, Grover Cleveland wins for the second time. Remember, he had won before, then he'd lost to Harrison, and now Cleveland is back in power. Side notes, your book talks about Cleveland, but Cleveland, this second election, he's going to be in charge during a major depression, the Panic of 1893, and he's going to see a decline of the gold reserve. So lots of problems during Cleveland's presidency. But we get to the election of 1896, the big one, and we have McKinley versus Bryan. So let's talk about McKinley first. He's from Ohio. Right? Remember, some are born great, some are born in Ohio. Nothing better for politics. McKinley's biggest supporter was Mark Hanna. Let's check out. Oh, there he is. Mark Hanna basically funded all of McKinley's campaign. He's a businessman, huge supporter of McKinley, and basically helped McKinley kind of buy his election in some regards. The Republican platform was to blame the Democrats for the panic. Bryan, who's right there, was a Democrat. The Democrats initially, at their convention, didn't have a clear candidate. They were divided on the issue. At the convention, Bryan gets up and gives this passionate speech supporting silver. It's often called the Cross of Gold speech. Here we have it here. Because he basically says, don't crucify man on a cross of gold. Don't make us be so dependent on gold that it kills us, right? We need free coinage of silver. He's only 36 years old, but people are so inspired they make him the nominee. And then, because he's so for silver, the populists end up nominating him as well. So although he's running officially as a Democrat, the populists are supporting them, and we have kind of a fused campaign, a demo pop party, as Pageant calls it. And Bryan campaigns by traveling all across the country, giving numbers of speeches, like 600 speeches, sometimes like 30 in a day. But unfortunately, it's not enough. Bryan does not get enough support, and McKinley wins. Don't worry, Bryan will be back. So that's kind of the summary of chapter 26. Hopefully we'll look at 27 in class. Please let us know in class if you have any questions on any of these topics.